There are places in this world that do not exist simply to be conquered, but to test the memory of humankind. Among them, the Amazon rainforest stands like an endless green curtain, both concealing and whispering fragments of a vanished world. Since the 16th century, Spanish explorers, and later the English, spoke of stone-built cities, straight canals, and plazas that now linger only as faint shadows in the stories of the native peoples. From those stories, a symbol was born: the City of Z. It was never just a location. It became a mirror of human longing, the yearning to uncover evidence of a great civilization hidden where old maps marked only a blank, forbidden space. That longing consumed Percy Fawcett, the British explorer, until it turned into his final obsession and ended with his mysterious disappearance deep within the forest. But is Z nothing more than a fever dream? Or does the silence of the jungle still guard something we are not meant to find? Step with me into this journey, where history, legend, and speculation weave together, to listen for what the Amazon still keeps in its green and endless hush. Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The Amazon does not welcome strangers. It swallows them whole, wrapping them in green silence and endless humidity until days blur and the mind begins to falter. To walk into this forest is to enter a labyrinth with no walls, only layers of leaves and shadow that shift with the sun. The deeper one goes, the more the world of rivers, soil, and sky begins to lose its familiar order. Even silence here has a weight, heavy and watchful, broken only by the screech of unseen birds or the crack of a branch beneath something large enough not to care about its own presence. For centuries, the forest has been a stage for both dreams and nightmares. Every generation of explorers seemed to believe that somewhere within its tangled expanse lay a secret too vast to remain hidden forever. And for one man in particular, that secret had a name: Zed. Percy Fawcett was not the first to imagine a lost city hidden in the Amazon, but he became its most enduring prophet. A British explorer hardened by years of service in South America, he moved with a kind of calm intensity, the air of someone convinced that the forest held more than tribes and tangled vines. He described Z not with the vague enthusiasm of a treasure seeker, but with the conviction of a man who felt its presence in his bones. To him, it was not just rumor. It was a destination already drawn in invisible ink on the map of the world, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to trace it with real footsteps. The forest seemed to conspire with him. He found fragments that whispered of civilization, shards of pottery too refined to belong to nomadic tribes, mounds of earth arranged with such precision they could not be the work of chance. Rumors of stone walls glimpsed where the jungle grew thickest. Each discovery was incomplete, like a sentence broken off in mid-thought, but together they created a rhythm, a pulse beneath the surface of the green. The Amazon, it seemed, had once spoken in the language of order and geometry, and Fawcett longed to hear that voice again. The risks were clear. Entire expeditions had already disappeared into the forest without leaving a trace, their bones perhaps now part of the soil. Disease lingered in the air like invisible mist. Jaguars moved like shadows with eyes that reflected the smallest flicker of torchlight. Rivers swelled without warning, turning paths into traps. And yet these dangers only seemed to heighten the allure. To Fawcett, danger was proof that Z had guarded its secret well, and that only the truly devoted could hope to reach it. The harsher the trials, the more glorious the revelation waiting at the end. In London, colleagues raised their eyebrows. Many dismissed his theories as fantasy, the fevered product of too many months breathing damp air under the weight of the jungle. They spoke of the Amazon as a dead land, incapable of supporting a large civilization. How could there be cities where even European explorers struggled to survive a single season? To these skeptics, the jungle was a void, lush to the eye but empty of history. Yet their denials only sharpened Fawcett's determination. For him, every scoff was a sign that the truth was being ignored, perhaps even suppressed. If the official maps declared the interior of the Amazon a blank expanse, then he would redraw them himself. It is easy to dismiss obsession until you see how it reshapes a man. Fawcett's letters grew more intense, filled with hints of patterns only he seemed able to connect. He spoke of symbols etched into the land, alignments of rivers that resembled deliberate design, voices in tribal legends that hinted at vast plazas hidden under the roots of strangler figs. He wrote of Z as though he had already glimpsed it in some dream or memory, as if his role was not to discover but to return. For his companions, his certainty was both a beacon and a burden. They followed him because his conviction made it impossible not to. Yet some whispered that the forest was not merely a place to him anymore. It had become a mirror, reflecting back his own unyielding belief until it threatened to consume him. Night in the Amazon magnifies that feeling. The darkness is absolute, pierced only by the glow of fireflies and the flicker of a campfire. Sounds echo strangely, as if the forest is speaking in voices layered upon voices. Fawcett often sat awake, staring into that darkness, as though he expected the outline of a temple or the glimmer of stone walls to reveal themselves between the trees. The men around him would lie restless in their hammocks, listening to drums in the distance that no one could place. Were they signals from hostile tribes, or the echo of something older still, a rhythm carried through the forest from a city that no longer exists? The deeper the expedition pressed on, the more the forest seemed alive with intention. Trails ended abruptly, rivers bent away from their course, storms gathered with uncanny precision. To the men, it was simply the cruelty of the wilderness. To Fawcett, it felt like resistance, as though the jungle itself tested them, demanding proof of their resolve before it would reveal its hidden heart. And so he pushed further, trusting that each hardship was not a warning to turn back, but a sign that they were drawing closer. In this way, Z was never just a city. It became a compass, a force pulling him onward through heat, hunger, and despair. The men who walked beside him may have seen nothing but trees and swamp, but Fawcett's eyes carried a different map. He spoke of straight roads buried under roots, plazas wide enough to host armies, temples that reached for the stars. And as his words painted these visions in the minds of his companions, the forest itself seemed to shift, as if what he described might flicker into being at any moment, just beyond the torchlight. But in that torchlit world of half-seen shadows, one question lingers. Was Fawcett following clues left by a civilization long forgotten? Or was he chasing a mirage born from his own hunger for wonder? The line between discovery and illusion blurred more with every step, and the deeper he went, the less it seemed to matter. Perhaps, after all, the road into darkness is not measured in miles, but in the distance between what we believe and what we can prove. And so the question remains, when the jungle closes in, and all paths vanish into green silence, what truly lies at the end of the road into darkness? In the wilderness of the Amazon, nothing reveals itself easily. The forest is a master of concealment, covering its scars and its ruins with vines so thick that even stone crumbles quietly beneath them. For centuries, the jungle has erased the footprints of those who once walked its paths, leaving only fragments. Objects too stubborn to disappear, but too incomplete to tell their story alone. It was in these fragments that the earliest whispers of Z began to take shape, not in grand ruins rising from the earth, but in subtle signs scattered across the green expanse like faint handwriting on a faded page. Travelers spoke of strange mounds that appeared too orderly to be natural, rising from the soil in circular or rectangular patterns. To the untrained eye, they were just hills among thousands, but those who lingered noticed their symmetry. Some were aligned with uncanny precision, forming lines that stretched farther than the eye could follow. Others formed rings, their edges now blurred with trees but still holding the memory of geometry. If the jungle was chaos, these mounds were interruptions, brief moments of intention breaking through the wild. What purpose they once served remained a mystery. Were they platforms for homes, fortifications, or perhaps ceremonial sites where entire communities gathered? Each possibility pointed to something greater than wandering tribes. Pottery emerged from the soil as well, cracked but decorated, its patterns repeating like coded messages. Unlike the rough vessels of survival, these pieces carried elegance, intricate designs pressed into clay, spirals and lines that suggested both artistry and identity. A shard of pottery, by itself, is fragile evidence, but when found in numbers across hundreds of miles, it speaks of a network, a people bound not by chance but by culture. For Fawcett and those like him, these fragments were not debris, but the scattered syllables of a language long forgotten. There were also the rumors. Always the rumors. Traders returned from deep river journeys with tales of walls glimpsed through the foliage, stones laid so precisely they seemed immune to the forest's decay. Missionaries wrote of tribes that spoke of their ancestors' great villages, places where plazas opened wide enough to hold festivals and roads stretched straight as arrows to the horizon. And in the diaries of explorers, there are half-formed notes about canals wide enough to carry fleets of canoes, weaving across the landscape like veins of stone and water. None of these accounts were complete, but together they built a picture that was difficult to ignore. Yet the jungle has a way of testing belief. Many who pursued these traces found only disappointment. Mounds that, upon closer inspection, seemed natural, walls that collapsed into piles of stone once touched, rivers that bent without pattern after all. Skeptics pointed to the forest's ability to mislead, to trick the mind into seeing order where only chance had left a mark. They reminded that human imagination was often the strongest architect, building cities out of shadows and myths out of silence. Perhaps, they argued, these traces were not the beginning of a story, but the end of one, remnants of small tribes whose lives were stretched into legend by the hunger of explorers. But for others, The very incompleteness of the evidence was the hook. If the forest gave only fragments, it was not proof of absence. It was proof of concealment. Every shard, every mound, every whispered rumor was a thread that, when woven together, formed the outline of something vast. And the more elusive these signs became, the stronger the desire to pursue them. Fawcett believed that these were not isolated findings, but scattered pieces of a whole that once stood proud and undeniable. The forest, in his view, was not a void, but a mask. Z was still there, waiting for someone with enough patience to strip away the disguise. It is easy to imagine him kneeling over a piece of pottery in the mud, turning it slowly in his hand, while the air buzzed with insects. The shard itself might have seemed unremarkable to anyone else, just a curve of clay, worn and broken. But in his eyes, it was a fragment of a cup once raised in celebration, a piece of a feast shared in a city square that no longer exists. To touch it was to feel time collapse, to sense an entire civilization pressing faintly against the present. For Fawcett, such moments were not simply discoveries, they were confirmations, whispers from the past that told him his journey was justified. But whispers can deceive. Some archaeologists who followed later warned against reading too much into the fragments. They argued that shards could travel far from their origins, carried by rivers or traded between tribes. A mound could be the work of termites as much as of human hands. A canal-like ditch might be nothing more than an old riverbed. To them, the traces were scattered coincidences, not evidence of grandeur. And yet, even these warnings could not silence the question that lingered. If the forest was truly empty, why did so many pieces keep rising to the surface? Perhaps the most haunting detail was how often these fragments appeared in patterns, as though the forest itself could not completely erase the past. A cluster of mounds would align with the sunrise, or pottery would surface in areas where the soil was unnaturally fertile. Such alignments hinted at deliberate choices, the kind made by communities with vision and design. They suggested not merely survival, but culture, something that stretched beyond necessity into meaning. And meaning, once glimpsed, is hard to dismiss. The first traces of Z, then, were not ruins in the sense of towering walls or statues. They were more like the afterimage left when one stares too long at a light. Faint, fading, but undeniable. They existed at the edge of certainty, where faith begins to fill the gaps left by evidence. For explorers, that edge was irresistible. Each mound, each shard, each rumor was an invitation to step further into the green labyrinth, chasing the possibility that the fragments might one day assemble into a whole. Yet the fragments also raise a deeper question. If there truly was a civilization hidden here, large and organized enough to leave behind these signs, how could it have vanished so completely? What force could erase not only its buildings and its people, but nearly all memory of its existence, leaving behind only whispers in clay and earth? And so the trail continues, deeper into shadow, where legends wait to meet the fragments of reality. But if the first traces are only the scattered bones of a forgotten city, what do the voices of the Amazon's oldest inhabitants, the keepers of memory, say about what once stood here? Long before Europeans cut their way into the green silence of the Amazon, voices were already speaking of cities hidden among the trees. To the tribes who lived along the rivers, these were not tales of fantasy, but fragments of ancestral memory, handed down in song and ritual, shaped by time into stories that shimmered between history and myth. When outsiders came asking about lost cities, the elders did not invent. They repeated what had always been known, though not always fully understood. In these stories, Z already existed, though under different names and faces, shifting like a reflection in moving water. One of the most enduring was the legend of El Dorado. To Europeans, it became a symbol of a golden city, walls glittering with treasure, a place where wealth lay scattered like dust. But to many native peoples, El Dorado was never about gold alone. It was the image of a great chief covered in sacred dust, performing a ritual on a lake, the wealth shining not as coins, but as offerings to the spirits of water. Over time, as the story crossed languages and empires, the Golden Man became a golden city, and the ritual became a kingdom. The deeper meaning, the idea of a place where humans and the divine met in ceremony, was overshadowed by greed. Yet within that shift, something lingers, a memory of a society organized enough to sustain rulers, rituals, and symbols vast enough to endure centuries. Other tales spoke of Kuhikugu, a city of waterways and defensive walls, where people once thrived in numbers so large they astonished even the most skeptical explorers. Here, the stories described plazas so wide that dances continued all night without ending, and roads so straight they cut across the land like the path of a star. The memory of Kuhikugu came not as a single story, but as a pattern echoed across tribes, each recounting a fragment. Some spoke of battles fought along its edges, others of festivals that united distant villages. Always, there was the sense of scale, of something far larger than a handful of huts hidden in the forest. The tribes told these stories without maps, without measurements, but with a conviction that gave them weight. To them, the forest was not a barrier, but a landscape of memory. Every river bend held a name, every mound of earth a meaning. Outsiders might see only trees, but to those born there, the land was filled with the footprints of ancestors, pressed into the soil long after their bodies were gone. Zoo, in this sense, was not just a city. It was a thread woven into the very geography, a presence that could be felt if not touched. When these legends reached European ears, they became fuel for obsession. The conquistadors chased El Dorado with swords and fire, convinced that a kingdom of gold lay just beyond the next river. They left behind trails of violence, but they never found the shining city. The failure, however, did not erase the legend. It magnified it. If the city could not be found, then surely it was hidden deeper, guarded more fiercely, perhaps even swallowed by the forest itself. What was once a ritual memory became a treasure hunt, and later still, a riddle of lost civilization. Yet not all explorers listened with greed. Some, like Fawcett, heard in these legends the possibility of truth wrapped in myth. To him, the stories of Kuhikugu or El Dorado were not fantasies, but distorted echoes of something real. Every tale, no matter how exaggerated, had to begin somewhere. A festival that became a myth of endless dance, a ritual of gold dust that became a city of golden walls. These were not fabrications, but transformations, like a river reshaping itself over centuries, yet still flowing from the same source. If so many voices across so many tribes spoke of great centers of life in the forest, could they all be mistaken? There is a peculiar power in oral memory. Unlike written records, which fix words on paper, oral stories are alive, shifting slightly with each telling. They carry the breath of generations, altered but never entirely broken. The danger, of course, is that detail may dissolve into symbol, fact into metaphor, but the strength lies in endurance. If a story survives centuries of retelling, it suggests that something in it was too important to let go. The legends of cities in the Amazon survived because they carried weight, even if the exact details were lost to time. For the people who lived these stories, the past was not separate from the present. To speak of the Golden Man, or of Kuhikugu, was not nostalgia. It was continuity. The ancestors were still present in the land, their memory woven into rituals, their names hidden in songs. And perhaps this is why the idea of Z remains so haunting. It is not simply the hope of explorers that drives it, but the persistence of voices that refuse to be silenced. Still, one must ask, how much of Z is history, and how much is longing? Do the legends speak of literal plazas and stone walls, or do they preserve, in metaphor, the greatness of a way of life now dissolved? When a tribe speaks of their ancestors gathering in vast numbers, does it mean cities as we understand them, or something less tangible? Networks of villages bound by ceremony and belief? The ambiguity itself is part of the allure. In the absence of ruins that stand above the canopy, legends remain the only architecture left visible. To walk into the forest carrying these stories is to see differently. Every mound could be a plaza, every straight path a buried road, every echo of drums at night the memory of a festival long ended. For Fawcett, such a lens was irresistible. He did not see legends as lies, but as maps written in myth. To follow them was to trust that beneath metaphor lay stone, beneath ceremony lay city. And so he pressed forward, carrying not only his own conviction but the weight of centuries of voices that had already pointed to Z. But legends have another quality, one that makes them dangerous as guides. They promise without proving, and in that gap, obsession can take root. Many who chased El Dorado, Kuhikugu, or Z found only hunger and silence, the jungle giving nothing in return. Yet even in their failure, the legends endured, because the forest never fully denied them. It always left just enough trace, a shard, a mound, a whispered story, to keep the possibility alive. And so the question deepens. If these stories are indeed echoes of truth, what catastrophe could have silenced the cities themselves while leaving their memory alive in song? Did disease sweep them away? Did conquest erase them? Or did the forest itself reclaim them, folding stone into soil, leaving only voices to testify? The echoes continue to whisper, faint but insistent. And if the voices of legend are not enough, then what of the explorers who vanished, leaving behind no proof but their absence? Could their disappearances themselves be part of the story of Z? There comes a point when a search is no longer a pursuit of knowledge, but a mirror of the seeker himself. For Percy Fawcett, the lost city of Z was not simply an idea drawn from native legends or fragments of pottery. It became the pulse of his own existence. Friends described him as composed, even austere, a man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority. Yet beneath that calm exterior was a hunger so deep that it consumed every other aspect of his life. To speak with him for long was to feel drawn into that hunger, as though the very forest had chosen him as its prophet. His notebooks, still preserved in faded ink and uneven handwriting, reveal the texture of that obsession. He sketched strange symbols, circles, and lines whose meaning he never fully explained. He described landscapes that no one else had seen, broad avenues under the canopy, ruined walls glimmering in moonlight, inscriptions carved in stone. Were these actual observations, or visions drawn from his own imagination? The question remains unanswered, but what matters is the certainty with which he wrote. In his words, Z already existed, not as a hope, but as a fact, waiting for his return. His correspondence with the Royal Geographical Society grew increasingly charged. While many of his colleagues dismissed the idea of advanced civilizations in the Amazon, Fawcett wrote with an almost defiant confidence. He accused them of narrow vision, of being blinded by old assumptions that the jungle was incapable of sustaining complex life. To him, the Amazon was not a wasteland, but a cradle, hiding a history that European arrogance had chosen to deny. Such conviction set him apart, and not always in ways that earned him respect. Among his peers, whispers grew. Was Fawcett a visionary ahead of his time, or a man slipping into delusion? For his family, the obsession was more personal. His wife, Nina, became both supporter and widow long before her time. She read his letters with a mixture of pride and dread, knowing that each new expedition carried the weight of finality. To her, Z was not an abstract mystery, but the rival that claimed her husband's heart. Fawcett, meanwhile, wrote to her of destiny, of a purpose greater than himself. He believed that finding Z would not only rewrite history, but transform the future, proving that the world was wider, richer, more mysterious than modern certainty allowed. The more he pressed on, the more Z took shape in his imagination. He described it not in vague terms, but in vivid detail. A city built of stone, with temples rising above plazas large enough for thousands, streets paved in straight lines, reservoirs gleaming under the sun, statues carved with faces that looked not entirely unfamiliar. He even suggested that its people were not primitive at all, but refined, their knowledge equal to, or perhaps surpassing, the civilizations of the Old World. Such descriptions went beyond speculation. They read like memories. Yet no one else had seen them. It was as if Fawcett carried Zed within him, conjured from fragments of clay and whispers into a fully realized vision. For some, this was proof of genius. For others, it was evidence of madness. Explorers who accompanied him often returned, shaken. They spoke of long days hacking through endless vines, driven by a leader who seemed tireless, guided by maps that existed only in his mind. They whispered that he trusted visions more than compasses, that he listened to the forest as though it spoke directly to him. And yet, in his presence, even doubt seemed to falter. Fawcett's belief was so absolute that it was difficult not to be infected by it. Even the skeptical found themselves imagining stone cities hidden just beyond the next bend of the river. As the years passed, the obsession deepened. Fawcett no longer spoke of Ze as a possibility, but as destiny. He compared himself to the great discoverers of history, men who faced ridicule before triumph. Columbus had crossed the ocean against common sense, and now his name was carved into every atlas. Why should his own journey be any different? He imagined a similar vindication, that one day, when Z was revealed, all those who doubted him would be forced to admit their blindness. And he, Percy Fawcett, would be remembered not only as an explorer, but as the man who gave back to humanity a lost chapter of its own story. But obsession has its shadows. Friends noted how his health began to falter, how his letters grew darker in tone, how he spoke of the jungle with both reverence and hostility, as if it were a living force testing him. His dreams grew vivid, filled with visions of temples and voices calling him deeper. Some claimed he was no longer simply searching for Z, but being pulled by it, as though the city itself demanded his presence. The line between seeker and sought blurred until it was difficult to know whether he was chasing the city or the city was calling him. There is a photograph of Fawcett that captures this strange duality. He stands in uniform, posture rigid, eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. At first glance, it is the image of discipline, of a man rooted in reason. But look longer, and the eyes reveal something else. An intensity that borders on fever, a spark that suggests he is already half elsewhere, gazing at something no one else can see. That look would follow him into the forest, into the silence, into the place where he and his companions vanished without a trace. And so, Fawcett's obsession became not just a personal journey, but a legend in itself. His belief in Z was so fierce that it outlived him, inspiring others to take up the search long after his disappearance. To some, he became a martyr of exploration, consumed by the very mystery he sought. To others, he was a cautionary tale, proof of how easily obsession can lead a man into darkness. Yet, either way, his name remains bound to Z, as inseparable as shadow from flame. But perhaps the true question is not why Fawcett believed so deeply, but why so many others came to believe in him. What was it about his vision that drew people into the forest, knowing the dangers, knowing the odds? Was it charisma or something more? An unspoken recognition that his obsession touched on a truth larger than himself? And if Fawcett was swallowed by the jungle, was it because he was wrong, or because he had finally found what he was looking for? The jungle does not give back what it takes. For every man who returned from its green corridors with stories of hardship, there were others who never emerged, their names absorbed into the silence. The search for Z became a web of disappearances, a chain of lives swallowed by the forest, as though each one was drawn into the same unseen current that had taken Percy Fawcett. The missing were not isolated tragedies. They became part of the myth itself, the jungle's way of weaving human obsession into its own narrative. Long before Fawcett's final journey, expeditions had been vanishing into the interior. Spanish conquistadors wrote in brief, panicked notes about parties that dwindled one by one, men lost to fever, arrows, and despair. Some survivors stumbled back half-mad, whispering of villages glimpsed in the distance, of smoke rising from where no map marked habitation, of drums echoing at night. The survivors' words were never coherent enough to form certainty, but always just clear enough to feed the suspicion that something, someone, was out there. Each failed expedition left behind not only bones, but questions, and those questions began to form a pattern. When Fawcett himself disappeared in 1925, the pattern tightened. His fame ensured that his vanishing did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it ignited a fever across continents. Dozens of search parties followed in his footsteps, and many of them, too, never came back. Some were professional explorers, others amateurs drawn by the romance of the unknown, but all carried the same hope: to find either the lost man or the lost city. The Amazon, however, offered no clear answers. Instead, it seemed to multiply the mystery. devouring one group after another, until the legend of Z was no longer just about a city. It was about the trail of absences that pointed toward it like constellations in reverse. The stories of those who vanished often echoed each other in unsettling ways. A party would set out, equipped with supplies, maps, and determination. Weeks later, a single survivor might return gaunt and feverish, claiming that the rest had been taken by hostile tribes, by starvation, by madness. Some spoke of villages that appeared suddenly in the mist, then vanished as if swallowed by the trees. Others described hearing voices in the night, chants that seemed to come from nowhere, pulling them deeper into disorientation. The jungle blurred the line between reality and vision, until it was impossible to know whether these were encounters with real communities or hallucinations born of exhaustion and fear. For those who followed the tales from afar, the effect was intoxicating. Each disappearance became part of the map of mystery, each death a marker that suggested the presence of something vast and hidden. Skeptics argued that the missing were victims of poor preparation, of disease, of predictable dangers in a hostile environment. But for believers, the sheer number of vanishings suggested something more deliberate. Could it be that the guardians of Z, whether human or otherwise, were protecting their secret? Was the forest not merely indifferent, but actively selective, swallowing intruders who came too close? Some whispered of tribes who remembered Fawcett, not as a corpse, but as a figure who had joined them. There were rumors of a white-haired shaman deep in the forest who spoke with an English accent, or of a tall man living among a remote community, his presence unexplained. These accounts were never proven, but they lingered like smoke, difficult to dismiss entirely. Each time an expedition failed, the rumor that Z did not want to be found gained strength. The city, or whatever remained of it, was not absent. It was hidden, guarded by disappearance itself. Newspapers in Europe and America seized on these stories, weaving them into sensational headlines. To the public, the Amazon became less a geographical region and more a stage for myth. The missing were transformed into martyrs of exploration, their names added to the roll call of the vanished. The legend of Z grew heavier with each loss, as though the forest was being paid tribute in lives. It became difficult to separate fact from story, reality from rumor. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Z existed most powerfully in the space between certainty and uncertainty, a place where absence became its own kind of evidence. The more disappearances mounted, the more they seemed to form an invisible network, a pattern not of roads or canals, but of human absence stretching across decades. Fawcett's vanishing was only the central node, the one that made the pattern visible. Around him, the others clustered like satellites, their failures orbiting his obsession. Together they suggested not only that Z existed, but that it was actively shaping the fate of those who sought it. Whether through the harsh indifference of the forest, the hostility of tribes guarding ancestral lands, or some deeper force beyond explanation, the result was the same. The road to Z was paved with the vanished. To walk into the Amazon with the name of Z on your lips was to step into this network knowingly, to risk becoming another point of absence. Some did it willingly, almost eagerly, drawn by the magnetism of the myth. For them, to disappear in search of Z was not failure, but fulfillment, a way of entering the legend even if they never reached the city itself. Others, however, went with desperation, hoping for fame, wealth, or validation, and found only silence waiting. Yet the most haunting part of this pattern is not the vanishings themselves, but the way they refuse to close the story. Each absence becomes a question mark, never a period. To this day, no bones of Fawcett have been conclusively identified. No trace of many others has been recovered. The forest does not return their bodies, only their shadows. And in those shadows, the legend continues to grow. The jungle, then, does not merely consume, it transforms. The missing do not vanish entirely. They become part of the myth's structure, their silence feeding the echo of Zeh. Every disappearance is both a warning and an invitation, a reminder that to seek the city is to risk never being seen again. But perhaps that is what gives Z its power. It is not only a place on a map, but a presence measured in lives that have slipped beyond the reach of explanation. And so the question becomes inescapable. If so many vanishings orbit around the same idea, can it still be dismissed as mere coincidence? Or does the network of the missing itself serve as the most haunting trace of all? That Z, whatever it is, does not wish to be found. It is one thing to doubt the existence of a lost city. It is another to silence those who insist upon it. The story of Z is not only about explorers who vanished into the jungle, but also about the quieter vanishings of evidence, reports, and testimonies that seemed to dissolve once they reached the halls of authority. In this sense, the mystery of Z is not confined to the green corridors of the Amazon, but extends into libraries, archives, and universities, where the guardians of knowledge decide which voices are allowed to speak and which are dismissed into silence. When Percy Fawcett first presented his theories to the Royal Geographical Society, he expected resistance, but what he encountered was closer to hostility. The idea that the Amazon could have supported an advanced civilization clashed with the prevailing image of the region as a barren wilderness, a place unfit for permanent settlement. The soil, European scientists argued, was too poor to sustain agriculture on a large scale. The humidity and disease made survival itself a challenge, let alone the flourishing of cities. For them, the forest was not a cradle of civilization, but a graveyard of futile attempts. To accept Fawcett's claims would have meant rewriting not only maps, but assumptions about the limits of human possibility. And so the gates of authority closed. His evidence, fragments of pottery, geometric mounds, reports from tribes, was brushed aside as coincidence, illusion, or misinterpretation. To many, this was not just academic caution, but deliberate suppression. If a civilization had once thrived in the Amazon, it would undermine centuries of colonial narratives that cast indigenous peoples as scattered tribes without history. Such a revelation would suggest that the forest was not an untouched void awaiting conquest, but the ruins of a world already lost. To admit this would require admitting that conquest itself had erased what once stood there. Whispers began to circulate. Some claimed that reports of large settlements were quietly filed away, miscatalogued, or even destroyed. Missionary accounts that spoke of vast plazas and networks of villages were rarely published, or if they were dismissed as exaggeration or fantasy. Archaeologists who speculated too openly about advanced societies in the Amazon found their careers stalling, their funding withdrawn. The silence did not always come in the form of denial. It came in the absence of conversation, the way a subject is quietly excluded from serious discourse until it begins to seem unworthy of attention. For conspiracy-minded observers, this silence was itself an answer. Why would so many voices be ignored unless there was something to hide? Was it simply arrogance, the unwillingness of scholars to admit they might have been wrong, or was there a deeper motive? Some suggested that governments feared the political consequences of acknowledging lost civilizations. If vast societies had once existed in the Amazon, then the land could not be considered empty. It would mean that indigenous peoples were not remnants of scattered bands, but heirs to a legacy deliberately erased. Such a recognition could complicate land claims, resource exploitation, and the authority of states built on the assumption of wilderness. Others pointed to subtler motives. The early 20th century was an age of progress and industrial pride. To admit that the Amazon once hosted a civilization equal in sophistication to Europe or the Near East would have challenged the idea of modernity as a singular Western achievement. It would have suggested that human brilliance was not confined to temperate zones or river valleys like the Nile and the Tigris, but could emerge even in the heart of the so-called green desert. To those invested in the hierarchy of civilizations, this was a dangerous thought. Easier, then, to let Z remain a myth. And yet hints of suppression continued to surface. Accounts of early explorers describe maps that mysteriously vanished, letters that went missing, testimonies that contradicted official reports. A Brazilian officer once spoke of aerial sightings of geometric patterns stretching for miles, only for his report to be quietly shelved. Anthropologists who recorded elaborate oral traditions among tribes later found their notes unpublished or ignored. To believers, these were not accidents, but signs of a larger design. The systematic burying of a history that threatened the accepted order. It is important to ask, though, why would institutions risk such a conspiracy? Perhaps the answer lies not in active deception, but in the quieter machinery of consensus. Academic authority often moves not by suppression, but by inertia. Once a narrative is established, that the Amazon was inhospitable, that its peoples were scattered, any evidence to the contrary is treated not as revelation, but as anomaly, something to be explained away. Over time, the anomalies accumulate, but they remain scattered, never allowed to form a new story. In this way, the myth of emptiness becomes stronger than the fragments of truth that contradict it. But for those who believe in Z, such explanations are not enough. They argue that the persistence of denial, even in the face of mounting traces, suggests more than inertia. It suggests fear. What if the discovery of Z would not only rewrite history, but destabilize the present? What if acknowledging a lost civilization meant confronting the possibility that our current societies are not as permanent or as unique as we imagine? Perhaps the silence around Z is less about the past and more about protecting the illusions of the present. The jungle, after all, does not erase evenly. It hides but also reveals, offering fragments at its own pace. The same may be true of history. What has been buried by authority may one day rise again when the silence can no longer contain it. And if that is the case, then the question is not whether Z was suppressed, but why it still resists emergence. Whose interests are served by keeping it hidden? The shadows of suppression linger. not in overt censorship, but in the absence of certainty, the way Z remains perpetually at the edge of possibility. And perhaps that is the most haunting thought of all, that the truth of Z is not lost, but waiting, locked in archives, in maps unshown, in reports unread, guarded not only by the jungle, but by the quiet decisions of those who chose not to believe. So we are left with a troubling possibility. If the silence surrounding Z is not only natural but intentional, then what else lies behind that silence? Could it be that the forest's greatest secret is not hidden under its trees, but in the hands of those who refuse to let us see it? There are some who believe that the mystery of Z cannot be explained by human history alone. The shards of pottery, the geometric mounds, the fragments of legend. These, they say, are only the surface of something far stranger. To them, the lost city of Z is not merely a forgotten civilization, but evidence of contact, a trace of an encounter between this world and something beyond it. The forest, with its endless canopy and hidden clearings, becomes less a stage of human ambition and more a landing ground, a place where ancient visitors left behind their mark before withdrawing into silence. The roots of this idea stretch far beyond the Amazon. Across the world, enigmatic structures have long invited speculation. The pyramids of Egypt aligned with the stars, the monoliths of Stonehenge standing like frozen echoes of some forgotten science, the Nazca lines of Peru stretching across the desert in figures so vast they can only be seen from the sky. To many, these are signs that our ancestors knew more than we give them credit for, or that they were not entirely alone in their achievements. When satellite images revealed patterns carved into the Amazonian earth, rings, lines, and squares visible only from above, it did not take long for imaginations to connect the dots. If the Nazca Desert was a message to the heavens, could the Amazon have once been a place where the heavens answered? Those who speak of Z as alien in origin point to the peculiar consistency of myths across cultures. In South America, stories of sky beings, gods who descended in shining forms, repeat with unsettling familiarity. Among some tribes, legends describe visitors who taught agriculture, who brought fire, who revealed the secrets of the stars. These figures are not remembered as invaders, but as teachers, beings who gave knowledge and then vanished, leaving humans to carry on alone. The same themes echo in myths from far-off lands: Sumerian tales of the Anunnaki, Egyptian stories of gods descending from the sky, Polynesian chants of star voyagers who guided the ancestors across oceans. Could it be coincidence that so many cultures, divided by oceans and centuries, share the same memory of teachers from above? For believers in the alien hand, Z becomes the missing chapter in this global narrative. They imagine it not as a city built solely by human effort, but as a place shaped in collaboration, a laboratory of knowledge where the ancient visitors left their tools and teachings. Perhaps the canals and earthworks once visible in the Amazon were not only for agriculture, but for purposes now forgotten, aligned with celestial events, resonating with patterns beyond human comprehension. In this vision, Z was less a settlement and more a beacon, a point of contact where the boundaries between earth and sky blurred. Skeptics, of course, dismiss these ideas as fantasy. They argue that to invoke aliens is to underestimate the ingenuity of human beings, to rob indigenous peoples of their accomplishments by attributing them to outsiders. And yet, the alien hypothesis persists, precisely because the forest has given us so little to disprove it, absence becomes fertile ground for imagination. Where there is no clear evidence of how such structures could have been made, the mind fills the void with possibilities, and the strangest possibilities often prove the most enduring. The conspiracy angle deepens when one asks why such ideas are ridiculed with such force. Why is it acceptable to wonder about trade networks or environmental adaptation, but forbidden to entertain the thought of contact from beyond? Some suggest that governments and institutions fear the destabilizing power of such a revelation. If it were proven that the earth had been visited in antiquity, the foundations of history, religion, and authority would tremble. It would suggest that humanity is not alone, and that our civilizations are not entirely self-made, but seeded, guided, perhaps even watched. Such a truth would be too vast to control. Easier, then, to dismiss it as madness. Rumors abound of artifacts found in the Amazon that were quietly removed. Pieces of metal or stone etched with patterns that did not resemble known cultures. Stories tell of skeletons of unusual size, bones that seemed human yet not entirely, spirited away before they could be studied. These claims remain unverified, whispered in the margins of old journals or the recollections of explorers who swore they saw more than they were allowed to speak of. True or not, they add to the atmosphere of suppression, feeding the suspicion that the jungle's greatest secret is not lost. It is hidden deliberately. For those who entertain the alien hand theory, the disappearances of explorers take on a new dimension. Perhaps Fawcett did not perish at all, but encountered something he could not return from. Perhaps those who vanished after him were silenced not by the indifference of the forest, but by guardians of knowledge, human or otherwise, determined to keep the truth concealed. To believe this is to see the jungle as more than wilderness. It becomes a veil, drawn across a doorway that leads outward to the stars. And yet, even in its most speculative form, the alien hand theory carries a strange resonance. It reminds us of the scale of the unknown, of how much we have yet to understand about the deep past. Whether aliens walked the Amazon or not, the idea itself reflects a hunger, the same hunger that drove Fawcett into the green shadows, a hunger to believe that we are part of something larger, that our histories are threads in a fabric that stretches far beyond the limits of our planet. The Amazon remains silent on the matter. It does not confirm or deny. It simply holds its fragments close, offering just enough to spark the imagination, and then withdrawing into secrecy once more. Perhaps the silence itself is an answer, a reminder that some truths are too vast to reveal outright. Or perhaps it is only the echo of our own longing, projected onto the leaves and rivers, waiting for meaning where none was ever intended. So the question lingers in the shadows. If Z was not merely a city, but a beacon, then who was it built for? And why has it been kept hidden for so long? If Zeg was real, perhaps it was never meant to stand alone. Some believe the lost city was not an isolated jewel buried in the jungle, but part of a greater web, a network of civilizations stretching across oceans, bound by knowledge we have forgotten. To entertain this possibility is to imagine that the Amazon was once connected to worlds far beyond its rivers, that Z may have been one node in a lattice of ancient centers, linked by trade, symbols, or something stranger still. The first hints come from patterns that refuse to be local. Across continents, the same motifs reappear: spiral carvings, serpent symbols, sun cults, and myths of floods and golden ages. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia spoke of a paradise drowned by rising waters. So did the tribes of the Amazon, who told of great villages swallowed when rivers turned violent. In Egypt, temples aligned with the rising sun marked the rhythm of the cosmos. In South America, legends tell of plazas and roads aligned with stars. Were these coincidences, or traces of a dialogue that spanned oceans long before Columbus and Magellan? Skeptics argue that human beings, given similar needs, often create similar solutions. Water, sun, and survival press the same questions, and cultures may answer alike without ever meeting. Yet the echoes run deeper than necessity. How is it that both the Egyptians and the pre-Columbian peoples of the Americas revered pyramidal structures as gateways between earth and sky? How is it that both the Andean peoples and the Mesopotamians told stories of civilizers descending from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of agriculture? These similarities, to those who believe in networks, are not chance but memory, the residue of contact across space and time. The Atlantic Ocean, in this vision, was never a barrier but a bridge. Long before caravels and compasses, there may have been voyagers, perhaps Phoenician traders, perhaps African navigators, perhaps cultures now erased, who crossed the waters and carried with them seeds of knowledge. In this view, Z was not a hidden outpost, but a partner, a mirror reflecting ideas that traveled farther than our textbooks admit. And at the heart of this speculation lies the ghost of Atlantis, Plato's fabled island civilization, said to have perished in a single day and night of catastrophe. To some, Atlantis is not myth but memory, the origin point of the Great Dispersal. When its center fell beneath the waves, survivors may have scattered across the globe, planting fragments of their lost knowledge wherever they settled. Egypt received pyramids. Sumer received astronomy. The Andes received their sun cults and stone fortresses. And deep in the Amazon, hidden under the green veil, Z may have carried the torch in silence. In this telling, Z is not a lost city, but a surviving ember of a forgotten fire. The conspiracy deepens when we consider how resistant modern institutions have been to these intercontinental connections. For centuries, academic consensus has insisted on sharp divides, the old world and the new, separated until the voyages of Columbus. Any suggestion of earlier contact is brushed aside as pseudoscience, unworthy of serious attention. But those who believe in networks ask, why the hostility? Could it be that the boundaries are defended not because the evidence is lacking, but because the consequences of admitting it would be too profound? If civilizations were connected long before modern history allows, then the narrative of progress, of discovery, of conquest would be rewritten entirely. The conquerors would no longer be the bringers of civilization, but the inheritors of a world already ancient, already linked. And then there are the alignments, the stubborn facts that resist dismissal. Archaeologists studying satellite imagery have noted earthworks in the Amazon forming circles and straight lines eerily similar to geoglyphs found in Europe and Asia. The Nazca lines in Peru form animal figures visible only from the air. Across the ocean, in Britain, the Uffington white horse stretches across a hillside in similar scale. Are these coincidences, or signatures of a shared language written into the land itself? Whispers speak of artifacts that blur borders, South American cocaine found in Egyptian mummies, Old World motifs carved into New World stone, legends in both hemispheres of serpents as bringers of knowledge. Mainstream science dismisses these as anomalies, as contamination, as overinterpretation. But for those who look for networks, they are proof that the world was never as divided as we imagine. The Amazon, in this telling, was not isolated but integral, a hidden chamber in a vast architecture of forgotten contact. To believe this is to see Fawcett not only as a seeker of a city, but as a man standing at the edge of a greater map. His obsession with Zed may have been less about a single place than about the possibility of connection, that in finding the city, he would also find proof that civilizations were not islands, but nodes in a forgotten web. Perhaps this is why he spoke of Z, not only in terms of architecture, but of destiny, as though revealing it would change not only archaeology, but the entire story of humanity. And yet, the Amazon has kept its silence. No stone inscriptions have been uncovered that link directly to Egypt or Mesopotamia. No relic has been unearthed that irrefutably crosses the ocean's divide. What we have are echoes, coincidences, whispers in myth and geometry. But perhaps that is enough. Networks, after all, are not made of single lines, but of threads woven together until the pattern emerges. The question remains, if Z was part of such a network, why has it remained hidden while other civilizations left their ruins in plain sight? Was it destroyed, its traces consumed by the relentless growth of the forest? Or was it concealed deliberately, its knowledge preserved in secrecy, passed down through story and symbol rather than stone? If so, then the network is not gone. It is still here, hiding in the green silence, waiting for us to learn how to read its language again. And so we are left with a tantalizing thought. If Z was part of a vast web that spanned oceans and ages, then perhaps its disappearance is not a tragedy, but a design. Perhaps the city is not lost at all, but sleeping, holding its place in the network until we are ready to see it for what it truly is. Once Percy Fawcett vanished into the jungle, the story of Z no longer belonged to him alone. It escaped his notebooks and private maps, flowing outward into newspapers, magazines, lecture halls, and eventually the public imagination. What had been the obsession of a single man became a tale that crossed oceans, reshaped by retelling until the city itself began to shimmer with new forms. Z was no longer just an idea hidden in the Amazon. It was a legend with a life of its own. In London, New York, and Rio de Janeiro, headlines carried the mystery into breakfast parlors and cafes. "Explorer vanishes in search of lost city," the newspapers declared, the words pulsing with equal parts wonder and dread. The public, hungry for adventure in an age when much of the world had already been mapped, clung to the notion that one last mystery remained. Photographs of Fawcett were printed beside speculative drawings of temples rising above the canopy, their steps overrun with vines, their spires catching shafts of sunlight. Readers did not need evidence. The suggestion was enough. The absence of proof became fuel for imagination, and Z began to take shape in minds that had never felt the weight of the Amazon's air. Writers seized the legend quickly. In the 1920s and 30s, pulp magazines were filled with stories of explorers stumbling upon cities of gold, of tribes guarding forbidden temples, of white-haired shamans who knew the secrets of the stars. Z inspired not only fiction, but a genre, the idea of the hidden city, the lost world where danger and wonder coexisted. From there, the influence rippled outward into novels and films, weaving itself into the cultural memory of adventure. Even today, when explorers step onto a movie screen to wander through jungles and stumble upon forgotten civilizations, the shadow of Z lingers behind them. But legends are not only born from fantasy, they are also shaped by fear. The disappearances of search parties who followed after Fawcett became part of the narrative, each loss amplifying the aura of danger. To the public, the jungle seemed less a place than a character, an active force that lured men in and kept them. Z in this framing became almost predatory, not only hidden but defended, as though the city itself resisted intrusion. Each failed expedition was written not as failure, but as proof that something waited within the forest, powerful enough to guard itself from discovery. At the same time, Z began to merge with older myths. Some equated it with El Dorado, the golden city that conquistadors once chased across rivers of blood. Others tied it to Atlantis, the sunken civilization said to have seeded knowledge across the world. In travelogues and articles, Z was sometimes described as a city of gold, sometimes as a city of stone, sometimes even as a city of light, its nature shifting to fit the desires of those who invoked it. The ambiguity only made it stronger. Because Z was undefined, it could be everything at once: a treasure, a temple, a utopia, a warning. Governments, too, found use for the legend. Brazil, eager to present itself as a land of mystery and opportunity, did little to silence the stories. The Amazon was a place both feared and desired, a frontier that offered the illusion of endless resources. To speak of lost cities was to frame the forest not as emptiness, but as potential, a place where wonders still waited to be revealed. In this way, the legend of Z served political as well as personal ends, transforming absence into allure. Yet not everyone was captivated by awe. Some critics framed Z as a colonial fantasy, a projection of European desires onto a land already inhabited. To them, the legend was not about a real city, but about the refusal to accept the Amazon as it was. Instead of respecting indigenous cultures, explorers and dreamers imagined grand civilizations that had conveniently vanished, leaving only ruins that needed rediscovery. In this interpretation, Z was less a historical mystery than a mirror of the Western mind, forever searching for validation that greatness could only exist if it mirrored its own ideals. And still, the legend endured. Even skepticism could not kill it, because legends thrive not on proof, but on possibility. Z lived in the space between doubt and belief, where evidence was scarce enough to invite imagination, but abundant enough to keep the idea alive. Each new discovery in the Amazon, whether pottery shards, geoglyphs, or traces of terra preta soil, was seized upon as another piece of the puzzle. Each mystery, no matter how small, was folded into the larger story, as if the forest itself conspired to keep the tale alive by releasing fragments at just the right time. Over the decades, the legend shifted with the times. In the age of pulp, it was a city of treasure. In the age of UFO speculation, it became a landing site, a place where ancient astronauts once touched down. In the era of ecological awareness, it was reframed as a symbol of harmony, proof that vast civilizations could live in balance with the forest without destroying it. Z became a mirror not only of Fawcett's obsession, but of every age's desires and fears. What gives a legend its power is not its certainty, but its adaptability. And Z has adapted well. It remains always just beyond reach, visible in rumor, in story, in the faint outlines glimpsed from satellite images. To walk through the Amazon today is still to feel its presence hovering in the air, not as a place on a map, but as an idea carried in whispers. And so the question grows larger. Is the legend of Z a shadow of truth, or is the truth itself the legend? That we create cities in the silence of the jungle because we cannot bear the thought of emptiness. Legends can swell until they seem to eclipse reality, but eventually, science enters the conversation. When the story of Z spread across continents, archaeologists and anthropologists felt compelled to respond, not with speculation or wonder, but with the measured weight of evidence. Their verdict was sharp and unsparing. The Amazon, they insisted, could never have supported a great civilization. To believe otherwise was to be seduced by myth. The reasoning was simple, almost elegant. The soil of the rainforest, known as laterite, is famously poor. Beneath the dense canopy, nutrients vanish quickly, leached away by relentless rains. Crops planted in such earth exhaust it within a few years, forcing small communities to move constantly in search of fresh ground. This, scholars argued, made it impossible for cities to rise. Agriculture could not anchor populations in place, and without agriculture, there could be no great plazas, no temples, no enduring centers of power. To imagine a metropolis in the jungle was, by this logic, to ignore the very laws of ecology. Disease added to the argument. The Amazon was home to parasites, insects, and fevers that ravaged outsiders. Malaria, yellow fever, and countless other afflictions spread with invisible ease. For modern explorers, survival was a daily battle. How could ancient peoples without medicine or technology have thrived where even 20th century expeditions collapsed? For scientists of the early 1900s, the answer was clear. They could not. The forest was not a stage for cities, but a prison of hardship, limiting its inhabitants to small, scattered groups. To support their case, anthropologists pointed to the visible present. When Europeans arrived in South America, they encountered hundreds of tribes living in villages, but no vast urban centers hidden in the green. Unlike the ruins of the Andes, the stone cities of the Inca, the fortresses perched high in the mountains, the Amazon offered no monuments, no pyramids, no inscriptions carved in enduring stone. Where were the ruins, if a civilization had ever thrived there? Silence, they claimed, was the strongest evidence. The forest had always been what it was, immense, wild, and unyielding. These arguments carried authority, but they also carried assumption. They measured the forest by what was visible in the moment, ignoring that disease itself may have been a legacy of contact. Smallpox, influenza, and other European illnesses had already swept through the Americas in waves of devastation long before explorers like Fawcett arrived. Some scientists acknowledged this, but argued that even before European contact, the Amazon lacked the conditions for urban life. To them, the great civilizations of South America belonged to the Andes, not the rainforest. The Amazon was backdrop, not center. The rejection of Z was so complete that it hardened into orthodoxy. To speak of cities in the forest was to mark oneself as a dreamer, or worse, a charlatan. Scholars dismissed Fawcett as a man undone by obsession, blinded by his desire to find what could never exist. His death, they said, was proof of the jungle's merciless truth. Expeditions could search endlessly, but they would find only fragments of pottery from scattered villages, nothing more. The dream of Z was not history. It was a fever dream. Yet science, like the forest itself, is never entirely still. As decades passed, cracks began to appear in the certainty. Reports trickled in of unusually fertile soil, patches of black earth rich with nutrients where crops grew in abundance. Locals called it terra preta, dark earth, so unlike the surrounding soil that it seemed unnatural. Early scientists dismissed it as a curiosity, a quirk of geology. But as more of these patches were found, spread across thousands of square miles, the explanation grew harder to ignore. Could it be that the earth itself had been transformed by human hands? If so, then the assumption that agriculture was impossible in the Amazon would collapse. Satellite images added further doubt. From the air, new patterns emerged. Circles, squares, and straight lines etched faintly into the forest floor, invisible from ground level. Thus geoglyphs were too regular to be natural, suggesting vast landscapes had once been shaped with intention. The question grew louder. If not cities, then what? Settlements? Ritual sites? Networks of roads and fields? Whatever they were, they hinted at scale, something larger than scattered tribes, something organized enough to leave a mark visible centuries later. Still, mainstream science remained cautious. To leap from geoglyphs and fertile soil to the existence of a metropolis was a leap too far. Evidence, they said, must be weighed with care. Until stone ruins or inscriptions surfaced, Zed would remain legend, not fact. But the firmness of earlier denial had already softened. Where once the Amazon was dismissed as incapable of supporting civilization, scholars now spoke of complex societies, of networks of villages linked together, of agricultural practices far more advanced than anyone had admitted. In this way, the scientific response to Z reflects a strange duality. On one hand, it is a story of resistance, the refusal to bend to myth, the insistence on proof. On the other, it is a story of slow concession, as fragments accumulate and the possibility of something greater refuses to die. Science does not confirm Z, but it no longer dismisses it entirely. The forest has begun to speak in traces, and the traces are louder than silence. Perhaps the most telling part of the scientific debate is not what it proves, but what it reveals about belief itself. To deny Z was once an act of reason. Now, to deny all possibility of complexity in the Amazon seems increasingly unreasonable. And yet science remains cautious, unwilling to grant the city its place on the map. It is trapped, like the legend itself, between certainty and wonder. So the question lingers, even in the language of research. If the forest could be reshaped by human hands on such a scale, then who were those hands? Were they villagers bound by trade, or citizens of a city whose name has been erased? The first cracks in the wall of certainty appeared not with ruins or inscriptions, but with dirt. To the untrained eye, Amazonian soil is uniform, red, thin, fragile, stripped of nutrients by the rains. But scattered across the basin are patches of a different kind, dark, almost black, rich with organic matter. Locals call it terra preta, black earth. And for centuries they have farmed it with success. Crops flourish here, where they wither elsewhere. At first, scientists thought these patches must be natural quirks, volcanic in origin or shaped by floods. Yet the deeper they studied, the stranger the soil became. Under the microscope, terra preta revealed traces of charcoal, bone, pottery shards, and organic waste. It was not a natural formation at all. It was engineered. Layer by layer, ancient hands had crafted fertile earth out of barren ground, creating islands of abundance in a sea of poverty. The soil was self-renewing, still fertile after centuries, capable of sustaining agriculture on a scale once thought impossible in the rainforest. In its quiet way, terra preta whispered the presence of people who had not merely survived in the Amazon, but transformed it. The implications were staggering. If vast stretches of the Amazon had once been covered in this artificial soil, then the region could have supported not small, scattered tribes, but dense populations, villages, towns, perhaps even cities. One researcher estimated that as many as 10% of the rainforest might have been reshaped into fertile land by human hands. That would mean millions of people, not thousands, once called the jungle home. The vision of the Amazon as an untouched wilderness collapsed. It was not empty. It was a garden cultivated and maintained, its richness erased only by time and conquest. Satellite images added another layer to the revelation. From above, the canopy hides nothing. In the 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologists began noticing strange geometries beneath the forest, vast earthworks forming circles, squares, and perfectly straight lines, some stretching for miles. These geoglyphs were invisible from the ground, concealed under centuries of growth, but from the air they appeared with unnerving clarity, as if the forest itself had been etched with symbols too large to read, except from the sky. The shapes suggested not only habitation, but planning. They spoke of roads, plazas, and boundaries. The forest had not been chaos. It had been mapped. Excavations revealed more surprises, remnants of causeways, raised fields that resisted flooding, fish ponds carved into the landscape. These were not the improvisations of survival, but the marks of design, evidence of a society that understood its environment intimately and shaped it to its advantage. Some settlements were so vast that researchers began to wonder whether they constituted urban centers, cities, though not of stone, but of earth, wood, and living landscape. If so, then the absence of monumental ruins was no longer proof of absence, but a reminder of impermanence. The forest consumes wood quickly, swallows walls and vines, and reduces cities to silence. Stone resists time, but earth and wood vanish almost completely. If it existed, might have left only patterns in the soil. The discoveries forced scholars to reconsider earlier judgments. For decades, the Amazon had been dismissed as incapable of sustaining civilization. Now, the evidence suggested the opposite, that it had once been a mosaic of thriving societies, their achievements hidden not by impossibility but by erasure. Disease brought by Europeans could explain the silence. Epidemics traveled faster than explorers, devastating populations before first contact. Entire communities might have vanished within a generation, leaving behind only the traces that modern satellites and excavations now uncover. The forest, in its relentless growth, completed the work, covering plazas with roots and swallowing roads with vines. To believers in these revelations were vindication. They argued that Fawcett had been right all along, that his fragments of pottery, his rumors of plazas, his visions of vast cities were not hallucinations, but glimpses of a truth waiting for confirmation. Perhaps he had been wrong about details, but not about the heart of the matter. The Amazon had once held civilizations far greater than his critics had allowed. The silence of science, they said, had been broken by the very earth itself. Yet even within this shift, caution remained. Scholars now spoke not of empires but of complex societies, not of cities but of large villages linked by networks. They acknowledged scale but resisted grandeur, as though reluctant to grant the Amazon a place alongside Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Andes. To some, this reluctance smelled of the same old dismissal, a hesitation to admit that civilizations of equal weight might have thrived in places long labeled primitive. But others argued that humility was necessary, that without inscriptions, temples, or enduring ruins, the full story could not yet be written. Still, the picture was changing, and with it the tone. Once, to speak of Z was to risk ridicule. Now, scholars began to use new words: geoglyph, terra preta, settlement patterns. They no longer denied that vast populations had shaped the forest. Instead, they debated the extent, the organization, the meaning. The conversation had shifted from "could it be" to "how much and how far." The city of Z had not been proven, but the soil itself had admitted something like it was possible. This transformation of perspective is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. The forest had always held the truth, waiting in its dirt and its patterns, but we were too blinded by assumptions to see it. We declared it impossible, and so we did not look. Only when satellites pierced the canopy and the soil spoke back did we begin to listen. And what it told us was not silence, but memory of millions of lives, of landscapes reshaped, of a history erased yet still lingering under the green. And so the question becomes sharper. If we can now admit that vast populations thrived here, then why stop short of calling them cities? Why not admit the possibility that Z, or something very much like it, once stood among these networks? Perhaps the forest still conceals more than it has revealed, waiting for the right eyes to read its patterns. If the soil itself can carry memory, then what else might the jungle still be holding, hidden beneath the weight of centuries? Among the many fragments scattered across the Amazon, one name rises again and again: Kuhikugu. To some, it is the most tangible candidate for Z, not just a rumor or a legend, but a site that still leaves its imprint on the earth. Hidden near the headwaters of the Xingu River, Kuhikugu is not a single village, but a complex of settlements, stretching across miles of forest, each connected by causeways, waterways, and defensive walls. Where the jungle now breathes silence, archaeologists have traced the outlines of a society that once may have thrived with tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, of people. From the air, the geometry of Kuhikugu becomes unmistakable. Straight lines slice through the canopy where ancient roads once ran. Circles of earth mark the boundaries of plazas, their shapes still visible despite centuries of encroaching trees. Raised fields, carefully engineered to resist flooding, ripple across the landscape in ghostly grids. Fish ponds lie dormant, their embankments softened but not erased. To stand on the ground is to see only vines and shadows. To rise above is to glimpse the skeleton of a vanished city. Oral traditions add another layer. Tribes of the Xingu still tell stories of ancestors who lived in great towns, who danced in plazas so wide the drums echoed until dawn, who built walls of earth to guard their people. These stories describe not isolated villages, but networks bound together, places where trade and ceremony flowed as freely as the rivers. When asked, elders speak of a time before disease, before disruption, when their forebears lived in abundance and order. Kuhikugu, in their memory, was not myth, but history. What sets Kuhikugu apart from other traces in the Amazon is the scale. Archaeologists estimate that as many as 50 settlements may have been linked within its system, some connected by roads running perfectly straight for miles. Defensive ditches surround certain areas, suggesting not only organization, but conflict. The size of the population remains debated, but even the most cautious estimates far exceed what early scientists believed possible. If these numbers are even half correct, then the Amazon was once home to societies on a scale rivaling medieval Europe. And yet, Kuhikugu left no stone temples, no inscriptions carved into rock. Its architecture was of wood and earth, materials easily consumed by the jungle. To modernize, it seems ephemeral, fragile, as though it never existed at all. But perhaps this fragility was also its strength. Wood, earth, and living forest allowed Kuhikugu to integrate into its environment rather than dominate it. Its disappearance may not have been collapse so much as erasure, disease arriving with outsiders, populations shrinking, villages abandoned. The forest, patient and relentless, reclaimed the rest. What remains is not ruins in the traditional sense, but impressions in the land, like footprints left in soft ground that hardened before the rain could wash them away. For those who still dream of Z, Kuhikugu feels like a revelation. Here, at last, is a city, or something close to it, hidden in the jungle, matching in part the rumors that haunted Fawcett. Could it be that he had heard fragments of these stories, that his obsession was born not from delusion, but from echoes of this very place? Some researchers think so. The area Fawcett called Z overlaps with regions where Kuhikugu's settlements have been mapped. It is possible that the explorer was not imagining a city at all, but sensing the memory of Kuhikugu filtered through legend. Yet even here, mystery endures. Why did Kuhikugu vanish so completely? Disease alone cannot account for the silence. Was there conflict, famine, or climate shift that compounded the devastation? Did the survivors disperse, carrying fragments of memory that later blossomed into legends of El Dorado and Za? Archaeologists can only speculate, piecing together soil, patterns, and stories. Kuhikugu offers more than most, but still not enough to fill the silence entirely. Conspiracy-minded voices take Kuhikugu in another direction. They argue that the absence of stone architecture is not a limitation, but a clue. What if the city was built deliberately to vanish, constructed in harmony with the forest, so that its knowledge would remain hidden? Some suggest that Kuhikugu was not destroyed, but concealed, its descendants retreating deeper into the Amazon, guarding their legacy from outsiders. Others go further, claiming that its patterns align with celestial events, that its roads point not only to rivers but to stars, suggesting a cosmology that stretched beyond survival into the cosmic. Mainstream scholars remain cautious. To them, Kuhikugu is evidence of complexity, of large-scale habitation, but not proof of empires or golden cities. They speak of chiefdoms, federations of villages, intricate but not necessarily monumental. Still, the language has shifted. The Amazon is no longer dismissed as barren. Kuhikugu, has forced the acknowledgement that great societies once flourished here, reshaping the forest in ways that only now are being uncovered. The debate is no longer whether large civilizations existed in the Amazon, but what shape they took and how far they spread. For the dreamers, however, Kuhikugu blurs the line between fact and legend. It is solid enough to be studied, yet elusive enough to invite wonder. In its traces, they see confirmation that Z may not have been fantasy, but memory. Distorted, exaggerated, but rooted in truth. Perhaps Z was not a single city, but the sum of places like Kuhikugu, woven together into the imagination of those who remembered them. Or perhaps Kuhikugu is only one surviving fragment of a larger whole, the faint outline of a civilization still mostly hidden beneath the trees. To walk among the shadows of Kuhikugu today is to feel the tension of presence and absence. The earth remembers what the forest has forgotten. The air carries silence where once there was music and speech. For archaeologists, the soil speaks with data and patterns. For believers, it speaks with ghosts. Either way, Kuhikugu stands as a mark, a reminder that the Amazon was not always what it appears to be now, and that somewhere within its vastness, the line between history and legend is thin. And so the question returns with sharper teeth. If Kuhikugu could remain hidden for centuries, what else lies waiting in the depths of the forest? Could there be other cities, other networks, still concealed under the green? And if so, was Z a single destination? Or was it always a name for something larger, a civilization we have only just begun to rediscover? There are maps that live on parchment, drawn with ink and compass, and there are maps that live in memory, carried in story and song. The Amazon has always held both, though the latter is harder for outsiders to see. For the people of the forest, the land is not empty but inscribed, each bend in the river, each hill, each clearing tied to an ancestor's name or a fragment of legend. To step into the forest is to step into a text written in geography, and in recent years, as technology peers from above, a strange convergence has begun. The patterns whispered in memory and the patterns revealed by satellites sometimes overlap, as if the forest itself were a book waiting to be read in two languages at once. Satellite imagery has made the invisible visible. From above, the canopy no longer conceals. Hidden beneath the green, vast shapes emerge, circles etched into the soil, squares aligned with uncanny precision, long roads straight as arrows. Some are hundreds of feet across, visible only from the air. They seem less like random marks of habitation and more like deliberate symbols drawn across the landscape as though the earth itself had been used as parchment. To look upon them is to feel both awe and unease. Why carve patterns that could only be seen from above, unless one intended to speak to the sky? These geoglyphs are not isolated. They repeat across the basin, echoing each other, forming what looks less like scattered settlements and more like a network, a web of connections strung across miles. Archaeologists debate their purpose: ceremonial grounds, defensive structures, communal plazas. Yet the geometry suggests more than necessity. Circles and squares are not the shapes of mere survival. They are the language of meaning, of design, of thought, stretching beyond the immediate. Meanwhile, oral traditions keep whispering. Among the Chingu and other groups, stories endure of roads that once connected villages, of festivals held in plazas so wide they felt like worlds unto themselves, of ancestors who shaped the land in ways now hidden. These stories speak of intentionality, of memory anchored to geography. And when archaeologists overlay these stories with satellite maps, a haunting pattern emerges. Places remembered in oral tradition sometimes coincide with the faint marks visible from the sky. The two maps, one of memory and one of technology, begin to rhyme. This convergence challenges the arrogance of earlier centuries. For too long, oral tradition was dismissed as myth, unreliable and fanciful. Yet here it becomes a guide, pointing researchers toward places where the forest conceals geometry. Memory, it seems, has preserved what stone and wood could not. And so the people of the forest, long cast as remnants of the past, are revealed as keepers of a history that science is only now beginning to validate. For believers in Z, this convergence feels almost prophetic. Fawcett relied on fragments of both, stories from tribes and oddities on his maps. He was laughed at for treating oral tradition as evidence, for seeing intention where others saw chance. Yet now, decades later, the forest is yielding patterns that suggest he may have been closer to the truth than his critics allowed. Perhaps Zed was not a city of stone towers and golden walls, but a city of memory and earth, a network of plazas and roads whose marks linger faintly in soil and story. Conspiratorial voices take the map of memory further. They suggest that the geoglyphs, so vast they can only be seen from the air, were never meant for human eyes alone. Perhaps they were signals, messages inscribed for beings who looked down from the sky. Others claim that the alignments of these shapes with solstices and celestial events are too precise to dismiss, that they form a calendar, a cosmic dialogue written into the land. If so, then Z may not have been merely a city, but a node in a global network of sky watchers, linked to the Nazca lines, to Stonehenge, to the pyramids of Egypt. Mainstream archaeologists resist such leaps, but even they admit the implications are profound. The Amazon, once thought to be untouched wilderness, is increasingly revealed as a cultural landscape, shaped deliberately over millennia. The forest itself may be, in part, a human creation, its diversity nurtured by ancient cultivation. The geoglyphs and terra preta suggest a civilization not only surviving but thriving, altering the environment in ways still felt today. The myth of emptiness has been overturned. The map has been redrawn. And yet the full picture remains elusive. The forest keeps its secrets close. For every geoglyph revealed, countless others lie hidden under unbroken canopy. For every oral story remembered, others have been lost to silence. The map of memory is incomplete, fragmented, demanding patience. To walk in the Amazon today is to sense the presence of what is not visible, to feel that every root and mound may conceal a trace of something vast. Perhaps this is the most haunting lesson of the map of memory, that the past is not gone, but layered, waiting for us to learn how to read it. The forest is not empty, but written upon, each patch of dark soil, each faint circle in the earth, another word in a language we are only beginning to decipher. And so we are left with a question that pulls us deeper. If memory and satellite can already reveal so much, what remains hidden still? Could there be entire chapters of history folded into the jungle, waiting for us to see the forest not as wilderness, but as manuscript? And if so, what story does Z write upon that hidden page? Cities rise and fall, but the idea of a city often outlives its stones. Z, whether it ever stood in the Amazon or not, has long since moved beyond archaeology into the realm of symbol. It is no longer just the dream of Percy Fawcett or the whispers of native traditions. It has become a mirror. In Z, humanity sees its hunger for discovery, its fear of the unknown, and its longing for a world larger than the one marked on our maps. Every culture carries such a symbol: Shangri-La in the Himalayas, Avalon in Britain, El Dorado in South America, Atlantis in the Atlantic. Each represents more than geography. They embody desire, the hope that somewhere lies a place untouched by time, where wisdom, beauty, or power has been preserved. Z stands among them, a modern addition to an ancient catalogue of imagined sanctuaries. Its power is not in being found, but in being sought. For explorers like Fawcett, Z was proof that the world still held mysteries worth dying for. In an age when most frontiers were already claimed, Z was a final horizon. To the public, it became a story of danger and wonder, a reminder that the earth is never fully known. To indigenous peoples, it resonates as the memory of a greatness erased yet still pulsing beneath the soil. Each perspective sees in Z what it needs to see, shaping the city into reflection. Over time, Z has gathered new meanings. To adventurers, it is a place of gold and temples. To conspiracy theorists, it is a node in an alien network. To environmentalists, it is a symbol of harmony, proof that humans once thrived in balance with the forest. Z bends and shifts because it was never fixed. Its absence is its strength. No ruins to bind it, no inscriptions to define it. Only imagination filling the silence. In this way, Z also reflects a deeper unease. We live in an age that prizes certainty, measurement, data. Yet beneath all our maps and satellites, we still hunger for what cannot be pinned down. Z endures because it reminds us that mystery is not gone, that some truths may remain hidden, and that perhaps not everything is meant to be solved. It speaks to a paradox at the heart of human curiosity. We long to discover, but we also long for there to remain something undiscovered. The symbol of Z also touches on a collective guilt. For centuries, the Amazon was dismissed as empty, its peoples described as primitive. The discovery of geoglyphs, terra preta, and settlements like Kuhikugu forces us to confront that arrogance. Z, in this sense, becomes a symbol of what was erased, civilizations decimated by disease and conquest before their stories could be recorded. The lost city may not be lost at all, but deliberately forgotten, its silence the result of our own violence. To chase Z is not only to seek wonder, but to reckon with absence we ourselves created. Art and literature have embraced this ambiguity. In novels and films, Z appears as treasure, as ruin, as paradise, as trap. Each version says more about the storyteller than the city itself. When filmmakers show explorers stumbling upon vine-choked temples, they echo the Western dream of discovery. When indigenous voices describe Z, they speak of memory, continuity, survival. The same city becomes a stage where different desires play. But perhaps Z's greatest symbolic power lies in its refusal to resolve. Unlike Troy, which was once considered myth until Heinrich Schliemann dug its stones from the earth, Z has not yielded itself. Its traces remain elusive, its outlines incomplete. This uncertainty allows it to occupy a liminal space, half legend, half possibility. To skeptics, this is proof of non-existence. To believers, it is the essence of faith. Z is not found, and so it can be anything. There is danger in symbols, of course. They can inspire obsession, as with Fawcett, whose life was consumed by a vision he could not let go. They can inspire exploitation, as when conquistadors pursued El Dorado into rivers of blood. Yet they can also inspire imagination, urging us to see the world not as closed but as open, inviting us to wonder what else remains hidden. Z carries both edges. It warns and it entices, reminding us that every search has a cost, but also that the act of searching gives shape to who we are. Even now, in an age of drones and satellites, Z remains out of reach. The forest is vast, and time has erased much. But perhaps its true endurance is not in what is hidden under vines, but in what it awakens in us. Z is less a place than a possibility. The idea that the past still holds secrets, that the map of human history is not complete, that there are still chapters missing. It is this possibility, more than any gold or stone, that gives Z its power. And so the city becomes a kind of compass, pointing not to a location, but to a truth, that we are always seeking, always haunted by the thought that there is more than we know. Whether it ever stood in stone or only in story, Z continues to live because we need it to live. It is the echo of our own longing, carried in the silence of the forest. But if Z is a mirror, what exactly does it reflect? Our hunger for wonder, our guilt for what was lost, or a truth that still waits, buried beneath the trees? By 1925, Percy Fawcett was no longer merely an explorer. He was a man bound to a vision, tethered to an idea that refused to let him go. The city of Z had ceased to be a hypothesis. It had become his destiny. He was 60 years old, his body already weathered by years in jungles, mountains, and rivers, but his mind burned with the same intensity that had carried him through decades of expeditions. To those who watched him prepare for his final journey, he seemed both alive with purpose and shadowed by inevitability, as though he already knew that the path ahead would not lead back. This expedition was different. Fawcett insisted on traveling light. No large entourage, no army of porters weighed down with supplies. He chose only 2 companions, his eldest son, Jack, and Jack's close friend, Raleigh Rimmel. Together they would be a small, mobile group, capable of slipping through the forest with little trace. Fawcett believed this simplicity was not only practical, but necessary. The jungle, he argued, rejected arrogance. Large expeditions had always failed. If Z was to be found, it would open itself only to those who approached with humility. They carried few weapons, fewer supplies, and a letter of intent. In that letter, Fawcett described his destination in vague terms, careful not to reveal too much. He hinted at rivers and plateaus, at paths hidden in the green, but offered no clear map. Perhaps he feared rivals. Perhaps he believed the city could not be reached by anyone but him. He wrote with the calm assurance of a man who felt chosen, marked by fate to complete the quest. As they moved into the forest, the world watched. Newspapers followed their progress, sending correspondents to Brazil, publishing updates with breathless anticipation. The expedition was covered like a sporting event, as though readers could follow each step through the dense jungle from the comfort of the breakfast tables thousands of miles away. When the reports stopped, Silence fell heavy. Weeks passed, then months. The men did not return. The jungle swallowed them whole, as it had swallowed so many before. What happened to them remains one of the Amazon's most enduring enigmas. Some believe they died of starvation, disease, or exhaustion, their bodies left to vanish beneath vines. Others suggest they were killed by hostile tribes, their presence interpreted as intrusion. Rumors spread quickly. One tribe claimed to have seen a tall foreigner living among them, perhaps Fawcett himself. Another story spoke of white bones found by a riverbank, believed to be his remains. Each claim was pursued, each collapsed into uncertainty. Nothing conclusive was ever found. For Fawcett's critics, his disappearance was proof of folly. They pointed to his lack of preparation, his blind faith, his disregard for caution. They called his final journey a suicide mission, the act of a man consumed by delusion. But for others, the mystery only deepened his legend. To vanish in pursuit of Z was not failure, but fulfillment. He had given himself entirely to the quest, and in disappearing, he became part of the very mystery he sought. His wife, Nina, never accepted his death. She insisted he was alive, living in some hidden corner of the forest, perhaps having found the city he had long sought. She held on to hope until her own passing, speaking of him not as a memory but as a presence just beyond reach. For his surviving family, his absence was both wound and inheritance, binding them forever to the enigma of Z. Search parties followed for decades. Some were official expeditions, others little more than adventurers chasing glory. Many returned empty-handed. Some vanished themselves, swallowed by the same silence. The mystery seemed to multiply with each attempt, as though Z was less a destination than a labyrinth that offered only two exits: failure or disappearance. The trail of the missing became part of Fawcett's legacy, expanding the shadow of his final journey. In time, the figure of Fawcett became mythic. To some, he was a prophet, a man who glimpsed truths before their time. To others, he was a warning, proof of the danger of obsession. His story has been told and retold in books, films, and documentaries, each shaping him into what the storyteller desired: hero, fool, martyr, dreamer. Yet at the center remains the same silence, the same unanswered question. What happened in the depths of the forest where he vanished? Perhaps that silence is the most fitting answer. Fawcett's final dream was not meant to end in discovery, but in mystery. His disappearance ensured that Z would never be closed, never fully disproved. As long as he remained unfound, the city remained unfound with him. The two became intertwined, explorer and city, both existing more powerfully in absence than they ever could in presence. Even now, nearly a century later, the thought of him persists. Fawcett walking through endless green corridors, eyes fixed on some horizon only he can see, his son and friend beside him, each step carrying them deeper into legend. Perhaps they reached nothing. Perhaps they reached everything. The jungle holds its silence, and in that silence, the dream continues. And so the question presses forward into our time. Did Percy Fawcett die in pursuit of a mirage, or did he finally cross the threshold into the city he had always claimed was waiting? The Amazon still stretches in silence, its canopy unbroken, its rivers flowing like veins through an unfathomable body. In that silence, the lost city of Z remains, whether as stone beneath vines, as memory in the soil, or as nothing more than a dream carried forward by longing. After centuries of searching, after countless lives given to the forest, the question has not been answered. And perhaps that is why Z endures more powerfully than if it had been found. When we speak of Z now, we are no longer only speaking of a place. We are speaking of the human desire for what lies beyond reach, the hunger for hidden chapters in the story of the world. We are speaking of the way myths bend to fit our needs, shifting from golden cities to alien beacons, from empires of earth to networks of stars. Z is less a city than a mirror, and when we gaze into it, we see both our capacity for wonder and our fear of emptiness. The forest itself seems complicit in this mystery. It hides traces just well enough to provoke, but not enough to resolve. Pottery shards, geometric earthworks, fertile soil, each clue invites us closer, but none closes the case. It is as if the Amazon is writing in riddles, offering a language we can only partially understand. Science provides fragments, legends provide echoes, but the whole remains veiled. And in that veil lies the enduring power of the story. Perhaps Z was Kuhikugu, a network of thriving towns whose memory lingered in story long after disease and conquest erased their bodies. Perhaps it was a single great settlement, its wooden walls long ago melted into the soil. Perhaps it was never one place at all, but an idea born from many places, condensed into a single symbol by those who longed for proof that the forest was once a home to greatness. Or perhaps Z never existed in the material sense, and yet exists still, in the imagination, in the yearning for what we cannot quite touch. The explorer who sought it most fiercely vanished into the same silence that conceals the city. Fawcett's disappearance has become as much a part of the myth as the city itself. His fate folded into the story so tightly that to find him would be to risk unraveling the legend. Perhaps that is why he remains unfound, why the jungle holds him with the same grip it holds Ze. Together, man and city are bound in absence, each haunting the other. To search for Z is to step into a threshold space where history and myth blur, where soil and story overlap, where the line between truth and belief dissolves. It is not only about what lies in the forest, but about what lies within us. The need for mystery, the refusal to accept that the map is complete, the quiet hope that somewhere, hidden, there are still wonders waiting. In this sense, Z is not gone. It is everywhere, in the black earth enriched by unknown hands, in the satellite images revealing forgotten geometry, in the chants of tribes who speak of ancestors dancing in plazas long erased. It is in the headlines that turned a disappearance into legend, in the novels that spun ruins into treasure, in the eyes of those who still look to the forest and feel that something vast breathes behind the trees. And so the story does not end. It cannot. To end it would be to resolve the mystery, and the power of Z lies in its refusal to resolve. Each discovery sharpens the outline, but never completes it. Each explanation opens another question. The city remains just beyond reach, always half-glimpsed, always almost. Perhaps that is the final truth. Z is not meant to be found. It is meant to remind us that not everything has been mapped. Not every secret has been told. The jungle keeps its silence, and in that silence, our imagination finds room to wander. So the question remains, as it has for centuries, does the forest guard a city lost to time, or does it guard the shape of our own longing? The canopy sways, the rivers move, the silence deepens, and somewhere just beyond the horizon of certainty, Z still waits.